Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Welcome. Today, Great.com talks with Peter Knight from WildAid.org. And if you haven't heard of them, they are an organization that work to reduce the global consumption of wildlife product, as well as increasing support for conservation efforts. And Peter, welcome.
Thank you.
So that was a short introduction, but how would you introduce your organization to someone that might not be familiar either with your cause and the challenges that you're facing?
So we were set up to try and end the illegal wildlife trade in our lifetimes. And that goal, we think, is attainable, at least to getting it to such a small degree that it doesn't continue to impact the environment as it has done. So the illegal trade in wildlife is billions of dollars a year, everything from insects to fish to tigers to rhino horn. It's a massive industry. And we've been making some progress in recent years, but as you can imagine, it's a big challenge.
Okay, so when I was imagining wildlife, I was imagining exactly the rhino horn, like you described, but I didn't think of fish.
If you look at fish, there's massive illegal fishing going on in the world. So whether it's fishing from within marine reserves or fishing beyond quotas, that's all illegal wildlife trade. And so, on that side, we've been doing a lot of work to try and strengthen marine protected areas, which are kind of the national parks of the sea. And we've been helping governments get proper enforcement systems, proper detection systems. So, for example, biggest project's been the Galapagos Islands. And people have been hearing in the news recently about how Chinese fishing fleet has been off the Galapagos Islands. And what we've done in Galapagos is we've helped them build a satellite vessel monitoring system so that they can actually detect where these boats are. They can detect if they're illegal fishing. And the islands now are very well protected. They have these systems, they have airplanes, they have well-trained rangers, and they're actually very well protected. But in many marine reserves around the world, it's literally a line on a map and it doesn't have any real protection. There's no real enforcement going on. So that's what we've done on the marine side. And on the broader side, what we're really best known for is our unique approach to try and reduce the demand for wildlife products. Because when you look at the wildlife trade, you have the supply, the animals in Africa, in the safari parks and things like that. They are protected by rangers, and that's largely supply side efforts to protect them. But there's also the demand for the ivory and the demand for the rhino horn. And where WildAid has differed from other organizations is we've come in and sought to impact that demand, which we believe is the driving force behind the illegal wildlife trade. And I think we've seen the trade in drugs. We've spent something like $25 trillion on trying to enforce our way out of stopping the drugs trade. But the demand remains very strong for drugs, and we're losing that war. And so thankfully, with endangered species, we've been able to see in real time how we've managed to move people off endangered species products on the demand end. And that's what we're primarily known for. And a lot of the work has been in China.
It makes me happy to hear that an organization like you is using new technologies to make sure protected areas remain protected. And doing something about the demand seems like a very wise long-term approach. So my limited knowledge tells me that there is a demand, for example, for rhino horns in China. How can you go about lowering that demand? It seems like something that is ingrained in the culture.
Well, first of all, if you think culture is a static thing, then you haven't been to China recently. I mean, Chinese culture is changing, even though there are deep-rooted practices which have gone on for a long time. I mean, if you went to China today and you'd gone 20 years ago, you wouldn't recognize it. And Beijing today looks a lot more like any other city around the world than it did back 20 years ago. So culture is already changing. And really our challenge is to make this part of that cultural change. Our methodology has basically been to use Western advertising techniques. So quite sophisticated advertisements using CGI, speeding bullets and things that hopefully are memorable and stick in people's minds. And then we have a whole series of ambassadors from around the world, over 300 now. People like Jackie Chan, Yao Ming, Jay Chou, who's a very famous musician in China. And so the messages are not being delivered by us. They're being delivered by local people in local languages, hopefully in very catchy and persuasive ways. And we've managed to get tremendous support from the government in China, but also from the media in China. So our campaign last year, we had about $230 million worth of donated media space. So by producing very high quality materials, hopefully they're interesting and exciting, they've got top celebrities and stars on them. That means we can get the free media space to get the scale to actually have not sort of the regular NGO campaigns that are kind of very small and you see a poster here, but massive billboard campaigns. For example, we just had a campaign in China on ivory with the Chinese customs. It was in every port of entry in China. So every airport, every crossing, there were these billboards, there were posters, there were TV ads running. And the scale has been phenomenal. And that's been all donated by that local media. So using that, what we're trying to do is make these practices socially unacceptable. And when you have icons like Jackie Chan, like athletes, like musicians, all coming and saying, this isn't cool anymore, that does rub off, and it rubs off with the youth, but also with the older generations. And we actually find that, some of the older people, so for example, a typical rhino horn user is probably a man in their 70s or 60s. And you're not necessarily going to influence that person. They're probably very set in their ways and not going to react to an advert. But we've had this happen. If their grandchildren say, Granddad, you can't do that anymore, you're killing the rhinos, then that can have an impact on the person. And we've seen this with smoking in the United States. Children have very often been the influencers. So you're not in these campaigns trying to necessarily change the consumer, who may be very opinionated and very old-fashioned, and also probably not exposed to too much media, because they have been exposed to media. They're probably aware that rhinos are in trouble and it's because of the rhino horn trade. But you're trying to get the society around them, and then it becomes socially unacceptable, and then you reduce the demand. So in the case of rhino horn, for example, in Taiwan many years ago was the biggest consumer of rhino horn in 1993. By 1995, there was almost no rhino horn consumption going on, because there'd been such a big campaign there that people felt it was socially acceptable to do it. And now in China, for example, in the last 7 or 8 years, the price of rhino horn has gone down by 2/3. Now, the number of rhinos has gone down as well. So it's not that it's gone down because there's more supply coming in. It's gone down because people have realized and understood that, for example, in Vietnam, people used to believe it cured cancer. And now people understand that's not the case. So both the price of ivory has gone down by 2/3, the price of rhino horn has gone by 2/3, consumption of or imports of shark fin to China has gone down by 80%. And so these campaigns, backed by the governments in these countries, have, I think, been very successful. We still got more to do, of course, but if you can release the tension at that end, if you can lower the demand, it gives the people on the ground, the enforcement people, the chance to then, fight their war, and it is a war on the ground, on more even terms. And we've seen the poaching of elephants go down. We had really good news at the beginning of this year from South Africa. The poaching of rhinos was down 50%, which may be partly due to COVID shutdown, but it's definitely a move in the right direction. So it's a kind of a 1-2 punch. You have to have the enforcement on the ground. You have to have the laws. You have to have customs looking for smuggling cases. But you also need the public, particularly the consuming public, to be on board and to be moving away from these habits, which are clearly unsustainable.
Right. And it seems like it's moving into a direction where you might not even need so many rangers to protect against poachers, because you're using this modern approach to influence people and change culture. And I really like that you're trying to do it from the inside, using local celebrities in these countries. So the government is paying for this, and they are giving you free advertisement space, or how is it working?
In the case of China, because obviously a lot of it's state media, and we've had tremendous support from state media in China, but also private too. I mean, private citizens want to do their bit by having compelling materials. We have a whole network of private vendors that also give us deep discounts. For example, billboard companies, usually we only pay the price of the printing, and they give us the space for free. So there are some philanthropic companies out there that are also helping. People like JC&Co, the billboard company, has been a tremendous supporter of our work. And you just create a situation where the norm becomes to not to consume wildlife products. So, when COVID came out, there was in China, they cracked down on the live wildlife markets. And we still, currently, the current thinking is that COVID originated in horseshoe bats. And they're not quite sure how it got into human beings. But one theory is it was through the wildlife trade, and it was through pangolins, which are an endangered species, which are consumed and do carry coronaviruses. But it hasn't been definitively proven this was the case or the source. But you probably saw that market in Wuhan that they closed down, which was thought to be the origin of this. So the good news about that is when that happened is a lot of people in the Chinese public came and said, look, why are we still doing this? This is crazy. Why are we still eating wild animals and bringing them into our cities and mixing them up? So there's been a massive sensitization within China. And now the Chinese government has come in and they have basically closed down both these markets. There's been some fake reports that they're still open. They aren't open. The government's come down really hard on them. But it's also closed down the breeding places where some of these were coming from. 80,000 facilities have been closed down in China, of breeding facilities. And so it's been a mind shift. And so, we've seen that you need the laws, but you also need the public on your side and public opinion. So we're doing campaigns now to explain to people these connections. And of course, previously SARS was proven to be from civet cats in wildlife trade. HIV came from primates, from monkeys to apes to humans via the bushmeat trade. And so we know this is a major conduit. And so we're now working with that to say, look, this isn't just about saving the animals. This is also about protecting ourselves. And wildlife trade, live wildlife trade in particular, is definitely a high risk for an introduction of new disease. And we've known that for a long time, but we're getting more and more cases. And of course, COVID, things like SARS impacted Asia, didn't really impact the rest of the world, had minimal economic impact compared to COVID, which has literally closed the planet down. And even if this time it proves that we find out ultimately that it wasn't pangolins, it could have been pangolins, very easily could have been pangolins. And next time it could be pangolins. And so, we're hoping that the tiny silver lining around this massive, horrible cloud that is COVID could be that we take a more serious attitude to stopping live wildlife trade.
I really hope so. It makes me sad in my heart when I see images of these wild animals being in tiny cage and being exploited. So yeah, it really makes me warm to see those changes happening.
And I've been investigating wildlife trade for a long 30 years now. And if you wanted to design a system to get diseases to jump from species to species, you couldn't do it better than the wildlife trade. The animals are hugely stressed. They're in awful unhygienic conditions. They all get mixed together. So their immunities are low. I mean, one study showed that the infection within rats, which were being traded, went from 5% in the farm to 55% by the time they reached the restaurant. So this is an accelerator. It's a combiner of disease. It's ideal, almost lab petri dish to get new diseases. And so to allow that to go on around the world on a large scale is frankly crazy. And it's not just China. Southeast Asia, a place like Vietnam have restaurants where I've seen bats, which are a major carrier of viruses due to their physiology. There's parts of Africa where primates and monkeys and things like pangolins and civets are still part of the bushmeat trade, and they're transported live. And so this is just another time bomb waiting. And if we can't now, after the lessons of COVID, move forward on this, then I don't know when we'll be able to.
So are you guys working on the bushmeat in Africa as well? Because it seems like, well, from my limited knowledge, I would think that, either from China or in Africa, something is going to happen. And I remember thinking this a year ago. I saw some TED Talks.
It's China, Southeast Asia, and West and Central Africa are kind of the hotspots for this bushmeat trade in dangerous species. And, we know that primates are very dangerous. They're so close to human beings. It's not a big jump for a disease to come from a monkey or an ape to human beings. We know that the rats are a bad idea, believe it or not. We know that pangolins and small cats like civets are also disease carriers. And we know some birds and then bats in particular carry a lot of viruses. And so these are things we should not be going anywhere near. And so we're doing campaigns now in Nigeria, for example. We were actually in November, before this all broke, we were in Nigeria with the actor Jaimin Hunsu looking at the pangolin trade there. And there were pangolins openly on sale. And we were with someone who was rescuing them from the markets, and there was also crocodiles and all kinds of other things illegal on sale openly and no enforcement. So the big campaign we're working on now is that, end the live wildlife markets, because when you have the animals live next to each other, obviously there's much more potential for disease to spread than if they've already been butchered and frozen or something like that. But also to stop the high risk species. There is some bushmeat trade in places like Africa where people did rely on it for a source of protein. There's a thing called a grass cutter, which is like a rabbit almost, and they breed like rabbits. And, that's been harvested, let's put it that way, sustainably for quite a long time. It's not in threat of endangerment, and it's not a big disease threat. But some of that stuff will go on inevitably. But the commercial trade in some of these high-risk species needs to stop. We need to stop bringing live animals into cities, which, of course, we were in Lagos. It's a city of 21 million people. Well, if someone in the bush eats some bush meat and they get sick and they're in a village and maybe 5 other people get infected, that's one thing. You bring it into a city of 21 million, and pretty soon, not only do you have a lot of people infected, but you've also flown it out the country and around the world. We've seen that with COVID, how it can spread so much. So we were looking for some common sense approaches to reduce this, both through legislation and better laws and better law enforcement, but also through public education.
That brings me into, I'm curious, what is the next steps then for your organization? What would be a great success for you guys in the next 10 years to come? What is realistic and what is a great success?
Well, we want to save the pangolins. First,
could you define what a pangolin is for non-native speakers?
Well, yes, and it's basically a scaly anteater. It's the only mammal that has scales. The scales are keratin, like your fingernails, and because they are like keratin, which is also what rhino horn is made of, they're used in traditional Chinese medicine. And so there is a demand from there. There's also a bushmeat demand in Asia and in Africa to eat them. Apparently, they taste like chicken. They're pretty small little things, but they breed very slowly. They'll have one baby maybe every 2 years. So they can't really deal with high predation. They're very shy, very elusive, very hard to find them. And you find, literally tens of thousands of them have been found, brought together, shipped around the world, often live. And they become very endangered. And so they're now the world's most trafficked mammal. And so before this even started, we were working on trying to protect them. We were working with education. And we actually even did an ad about 3 years ago where we had somebody sat pretending to eat a pangolin, and they put gloves on, they put a mask on. Now very familiar scenes. And the thing was saying, if you're eating pangolin, there's a risk that you could contract a new disease. So we were already working on this before this broke, but we're now expanding that to look at other species. So what we'd like to see happen is what's happened in China now. They've come up with a new list now of what can and can't be eaten. And so the can list is now very, very short. And there's 4 deer species, and there's quail and pheasants, like 10 bird species, basically game birds that we would recognize anywhere in the world. All around the world, people eat pheasant, quail, venison, wild boar and things like that. There's certain species which are I call semi-domesticated, and that's relatively okay. So China has now done that. They've had a very short list. Everything else is off the menus.
Cats and dogs as well?
Cats and dogs is not on the list. And that hasn't been reported widely anywhere, but it's not on the list. So technically that cannot be used as food in China anymore. So, we'll see, but so far it's being very strictly enforced. And we need that shift in other countries as well, because still in Vietnam and Laos and Myanmar and other countries in Southeast Asia, these things are still offered at restaurants. But we think every country should have this clean list, a very short list of what's okay. Everything else is taboo. And instead of having an ever longer list of thousands of endangered species, which nobody knows what they are, you have a very short list of easily recognizable species that's easy to enforce. It's easy for the public. So we'd like to see that all around the world. And then we'd like to see public education around that all around the world, so people are aware of the risk, they are aware of the disease risks, as well as the endangerment of the animals. And it's just not popular anymore. It's seen as something that's crass and dangerous, which it is. It's a huge danger, not just to the animals, but to human beings and to our economies. Look at the economic impact of COVID. We can't afford another mess.
No, it would be cheaper doing something about it. So
Absolutely.
I'm torn between 2 places now. I have one big sense of relief in my body because the improvements in China in this area were much bigger than I were aware of. So I feel really happy about the trajectory of the Earth from that. And on the other hand, I understand that you guys still have some way to go. So imagine how someone listening to this feeling, okay, I want to help out in some way. I want to take us all the way to a place where we only eat this short list of animal. What can someone do to help out and stay updated with your organization?
So please, we actually have a petition at endthetrade.com, which people can sign on to, which is going to all the governments of the world to essentially achieve that. But also come and visit wildaid.org and have a look there and try and follow us, get on our newsletter. You can stay up to date with the news. As you say, this hasn't been reported. The Chinese, unfortunately, people love bad news. They don't like good news. And so these positive reactions, I mean, we want to say, look, let's encourage China and let's ask other countries to do the same. Hasn't been widely reported. You can get all that kind of information and stay in touch with us through wildaid.org and hopefully become a supporter and be one of the family, and also communicate to other people, to your friends and families and people around the world what's happening. Because a lot of it is peer-to-peer communication. We can do advertising and do this, but obviously person to person can be very persuasive.
Peter Knight, thank you so much for taking the time to speak in with Great.com today.
Thank you.
And for you listening, if you enjoyed this, the purpose why we do this podcast is for you to get good news and stay informed at the same time. And this was a great example of positive changes that is happening in the world all the time, but that you might not be aware of unless you watch inspiring, uplifting conversations like the one we just had. And if you would like for more people to be able to listen to conversations like this, please go into your podcast app and hit subscribe. That would really help us to get into different top lists, and then more people can listen to interviews like this. Thank you so much for listening, and we see you in the next episode.